Building cinematic suspense isn't just some happy accident. It is a highly calculated science. Today, we're unlocking the hidden mechanics of tension on screen. In this explainer, I'm going to show you exactly how audience manipulation works, and by the end of this, you will see exactly how your strings are being pulled. Let's get right into it. Here's the agenda for today. First, the rules of suspense. Then, absolute director control. Number 3, visual motifs and metaphors. 4, manipulating cinematic time. And finally, number 5, the psychology of plausibility. You're about to learn the concrete laws of how a thriller takes over your mind. Part 1, the rules of suspense, or mastering audience manipulation. Let's look at how you engineer a gripping plot, literally from the ground up. So as a storyteller, you're often forced into a choice, right? Do you want a static plot with incredibly subtle, deep characters? Or a highly stylized situation where the characters are, well, kind of like simple algebraic figures? If we're talking about pure suspense, the absolute rule is to build on strong situations. When a situation is just inherently powerful, like say two strangers casually agreeing to swap murders on a train, that stylization is so incredibly exciting to the mind. It becomes completely fascinating, even if the characters themselves are just basic archetypes serving a much, much larger design. Okay, let's break down the anatomy of a suspenseful diversion. Imagine our protagonist sneaks into a house at night, right? And he has a hidden motive. Maybe he's going upstairs to warn someone. Well, if he just tiptoes up the stairs, you, as the viewer, are instantly going to try and guess what's waiting up there. So, step 2, we introduce a sudden, entirely unrelated threat. Boom, a massive, menacing dog sitting right in the middle of the staircase. Suddenly, the only question in your mind is, wait, is that dog gonna bite him? By creating this diversion, we completely wipe out your initial anticipation. So when the protagonist finally does get upstairs, the actual twist waiting in that room hits so much harder, just because you were entirely distracted by the dog. It's brilliant. Moving on to part 2, absolute director control, or idiot-proofing the edit. Let's talk about why a master storyteller has to maintain an absolute iron fist over every single frame they shoot. The real secret sauce here is a protective measure known as jigsaw cutting. So what does that actually mean? Well, it means shooting highly specific, fragmented pieces of footage. We're talking precise angles, running for exact lengths of time, so that these pieces can literally only be assembled one single way. You are effectively idiot-proofing the film against studio interference. Working like this guarantees that the final edit follows the exact psychological blueprint you designed during the shoot. There is zero room for an overzealous studio cutter to come in and ruin the tension. It's locked in. The flip side? The immense danger of overshooting. If you shoot way too much footage, like say you're trying to cover a massive crowd at a tennis match from every conceivable angle, you inherently surrender that absolute control to the cutting room. Since there's just too much material for you to physically handle yourself, you have to hand it over to someone else to sort out. And the moment you do that, you never quite know what crucial psychological beat might just be left on the cutting room floor. You totally lose your intended vision. Section 3, visual motifs and metaphors, the psychological blueprint. In a true masterclass of suspense, absolutely nothing is random. Every single camera angle and prop placement serves a deep psychological purpose. For example, crisscrossing rails and colliding feet, those aren't just clever shots to look pretty. If you keep a camera very, very low, practically grazing the railroad tracks, and follow two strangers' feet moving in completely different directions until they accidentally bump into each other in a train car, man, that perfectly establishes two divergent courses. It's two completely different ways of life, suddenly and violently crashing together. You don't even need to show their faces yet. The visual metaphor does all the heavy lifting for the storytelling. Now, what's really fascinating is how this extends to the characters themselves through a split personality motif. Imagine a great thriller centered around an interchangeable killing. You have your hero and you have your psychopath. The psychopath commits the brutal murder, sure, but the hero actually deeply benefits from it. So even though one is seemingly innocent and the other is a literal killer, their actions and their guilt perfectly mirror one another. Psychologically speaking, they represent a single entity split right down the middle into dual archetypes. The guilt is completely transferred just through the visual narrative. It's wild. Okay, part 4, manipulating cinematic time, expanding and contracting reality. This is where we look at how stretching and squeezing time literally affects the audience's nervous system. Time in suspense is entirely subjective. First up, we have compressed time. Picture a frantic tennis match. The hero has to win right now, immediately.
And that's intercut with the villain desperately trying to fish a dropped lighter out of a street drain. The pacing is rapid fire. You're literally squeezing time like a lemon, pushing the viewer to the absolute edge of their seat. But then, contrast that with decompress time. The villain reaches an amusement park to frame the hero, but he realizes, wait, I can't do this in broad daylight. So he asks someone, hey, what time does it get dark around here? And suddenly, everything just slows down. The decompression is agonizing because you are forced to sit there and wait helplessly right alongside him. It's such a stunning, dramatic play with your own internal clock.
So how do you actually release all that tightly wound tension? Well, you need what musicians call a coda, a sudden paroxysm of action. We're talking a spectacular, runaway climax, something like a miniature carousel spinning violently out of control and practically crushing the villain. Look, after so much tightly coiled suspense, it is absolutely required form to shatter that tension with an explosive visual breakdown. You have to give the audience that emotional release, or they'll go crazy. Finally, part 5, the psychology of plausibility and why the truth often fails. Let's touch on audience expectations and the real limitations of reality in storytelling. I want you to consider this provocative question for a second. Why does the audience reject the truth? Think about a scenario where a priest hears a murderer's confession, and then that very priest goes on trial for the exact same murder. He refuses to speak up to save his own life because of his vows. Now, you could argue that this could easily happen in the real world, but the audience, they will inherently reject it. They'll throw their hands up and say, ridiculous, no man would sacrifice his life just to remain silent. They reject the truth because they evaluate a story based on their own internal logic, not on weird, real-world anomalies. And the crucial point here is this. Total plausibility and authenticity merely add up to a documentary. If you're making a mystery or a thriller, pure, unadulterated seriousness often feels incredibly heavy-handed. You really need a subtle irony. Telling a serious story with a slight tongue-in-cheek approach is absolutely indispensable. Because if you just want total clinical authenticity, well, you aren't making suspense anymore. You're just making a case history. To prove that reality is often way too illogical for fiction, let's look at the real-life 1890s Bartlett case. Okay, so a husband, a young wife, and a parson all live together. The husband is found dead from chloroform poisoning. Naturally, the wife and parson are arrested, but then medical experts prove the husband couldn't possibly have been asleep when he swallowed it because his windpipe was unburned. And obviously, he wouldn't just voluntarily swallow poison while awake. It made absolutely no sense. It was totally illogical. The jury acquitted the wife simply because there was zero proof of how she actually did it. And the public, get this, they gave her a standing ovation at the theater that exact same night. I mean, if you put this bizarre, unresolved reality into a thriller, the audience would literally riot. It's just too messy for a satisfying fictional narrative. So where do we find true realism in suspense? It's all in the psychological details. True realism is a trivial, everyday conversation at a breakfast table that perfectly masks a feeling of absolute inner panic. It's when the soundtrack tells you one completely innocuous thing, but the visual image brilliantly contradicts it. It's understanding that people rarely express their inner terror out loud. Instead, it's their eyes that reveal the actual truth. Realism isn't about the plot being physically plausible. It's entirely about the emotional reality of the character's silent fears. We have covered a massive amount of ground in this explainer today, from jigsaw cutting to the illusion of cinematic time. But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. When you are sitting there watching a brilliantly crafted thriller, are you decoding the narrative, or is the narrative actually decoding you? Think about how easily your anticipation is manipulated, how your guilt is transferred to a character, and how your internal clock is squeezed. The next time you find yourself gripping the armrests during a film, I want you to ask yourself, who is really in control?